Before I introduce the moderator, I may want to suggest to you that the gentleman seated to my far right is not Walter Cronkite.
I'm not Dick Hartlett.
He's not Dick Hartlett either. Who is that guy? Well, I think you'll enjoy this. I know you're going to enjoy this session. This is a conversation with Andy Rooney, The War That Changed the World, A Journalist's View. The gentleman that is going to introduce him is a friend of this museum, outstanding scholar and historian in his own right. He is the John Henry McCracken Professor of History at Lafayette College. He hosted a series, Biography of America, on PBS and has appeared in numerous other PBS programs in the American Experience series, as well as programs on the History Channel. He is the author of 8 previous books, among them The Prize-Winning City of the Century, The Epic of Chicago and Making of America, The Story of World War II, and D-Days in the Pacific. I said 8 previous books because I get paid to advertise the latest book, Masters of the Art of the Air. And Don, this is number 1 on
No, not number 1, but it's selling well.
Selling well, all right. But it's a book club, right?
Yeah.
It's book club.
Book club, yeah.
And I also get paid to sell Mr. Rooney's book, Andy Rooney, My War. So if you don't have this book, we have plenty copies of both. It's my pleasure at this time to introduce to you a great gentleman who will moderate and interview Mr. Rooney this afternoon, Don Miller. Don?
Thank you. Well, it's a very intimidating thing to interview Andy Rooney. Luckily, I've talked to Andy before about his war experiences, and he didn't bite my head off. He's not the ferocious figure that I thought he'd be. But I think something, you get some potted biographies of people. We have them on our on our program and things like that. But the one thing that really stands out for me with Andy is that he's the only war correspondent in World War II to win the Bronze Star and the Air Medal for flying 5 combat missions. Andy,
Those and 50 cents will buy you a Coke.
Andy, we've been talking earlier, panels and things like that. World War II was a pageant of misery. 60 million people killed, 40 million of them civilians. Yet for people like yourself and thousands of others who lived through it, it was an exhilarating experience.
There was never anything like it. It's a terrible thing to say, but I was lucky to be of an age. I had finished my junior year in college, and I hated the Army. I hated everything about the military. And I was drafted at the end of my junior year. I registered in the college town I was in, Hamilton, where Colgate University was, and I thought they would be amenable to letting juniors finish their senior year. Well, the head of the draft board was also the local druggist, and he was head of the American Legion, and he thought every American boy should serve now. So I was drafted, never finished college. I think you can see that sometimes.
You thought you might be a conscientious objector.
I did, and I ultimately decided that I was not enough of an intellectual to be a conscientious objector. I had really strong feelings that war under any circumstances is wrong. But then I got reading more about what Adolf Hitler was doing at that time, and it was hard to justify being a conscientious objector. So I never registered as one.
And then you were drafted in I guess it was the summer of '41, right before Pearl Harbor, and sent with an artillery company to Great Britain.
Well, I was first sent to Fort Bragg, and it just reinforced my hatred of everything. I hate Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I hate all of North Carolina to this day, just because of that. Poor North Carolina didn't do anything to me, but I don't think kindly of it. And I was in North Carolina with a training in an artillery unit for 3 or 4 months before we were sent overseas. And I had I can tell this, we got time.
Yeah.
I had a captain I really disliked. And we went out on the range one day, and there were 3 batteries of 155 howitzers, and each gun had a 10-man crew. And my only job, somebody had to lift these shells were big, they weighed 140 pounds, something like that. And they had to be lifted into the cradle behind the howitzer. And my only job was to shove this missile into the breech. And then I disappeared. And but I always said I was in the artillery. And I've lost it.
Well, you know, I think everybody wants to know how all of a sudden Andy Rooney, the artillerist, becomes Andy Rooney, the correspondent.
Well, I was shipped to England, and I had been editor of my college newspaper, and I started writing some stories for the Stars and Stripes from my unit. And the Stars and Stripes was a very good professional newspaper, but it was a weekly at that time. And they suddenly dumped 2 million American soldiers into the British Isles, and they realized they had to have a daily newspaper. So they needed reporters and newspaper people, and I lied and said I was one, and and got the job, and I held on until I learned how to do it. And it was probably the single most fortuitous event in my life, because I got to go everywhere. I saw the war like nobody. Very few people saw World War II as I did, because there was nowhere I couldn't go. I flew with the 8th Air Force on 5 missions. I saw the bombing raids. I talked to the people who came back, got all their information. And then shortly after D-Day, D4, I went into Normandy, and then I traveled with the First Army mostly, all across France and into Germany. And we could go anywhere. I was telling Don, there were not the limitations on correspondence then that there are now. I could really get information and write it. We had censors, but we all know what the rules were. You didn't want to give the Germans any information that they could use. And we were no more interested in giving that to the Germans than anybody else, so that we didn't write anything. We knew what would be good for the Germans and what wouldn't. So there was very little censorship. They read our stuff, but very seldom had to take anything out of it. And then I moved right across and into Paris, where we set up an Army newspaper headquarters, the Stars and Stripes. The New York Herald Tribune had a building there for years, and they had some woman who had kept it up all during the war while the Germans occupied Paris. So when we got there, the presses and everything were still in very good shape. And 3 days after the Army got to Paris, we, with the Stars and Stripes, were able to start publishing a daily newspaper.
Well, we might as well stop right now, because Andy's answered every question I have on this tablet. Andy, when you were in England, when you first arrived there, you write that the greatest story at the time was the air war. And you wrote an incredible column in Stars and Stripes about how the real story of the 8th Air Force was getting submerged under a pile of cold statistics. What was the real story of the 8th Air Force?
Well, it was very tough for me. I would go out to these bases, and they would have a crew, B-17 crew was 10 men. And I would get to know these guys. I'd have dinner with them, and we'd laugh and joke together. And then they would decide, whoever the higher-ups were, that there would be a raid the following day. And I couldn't believe, here I was a newspaperman, and they told me, now you have a hard time getting out of the government what they did yesterday, let alone what they're going to do tomorrow.
Right.
So they always told us we were going out, and I went with them a couple of times, not often. I mean, I wouldn't be here today if I had gone on 25 raids. But I got to know the guys, and it was always so sad. You know, the day after a raid, you would come in one of the barracks, and one of the beds everything was still there. The bed was made, and the picture of the wife or children was on the little stand behind, but he was gone. And you knew instantly what had happened. You didn't have to ask any questions. He had been killed on the raid. They were losing 4 or 5% of all the bombers they sent over Germany. Now, if you have each crew airman had to do 25 missions before he got to go back to the United States. Well, if you're losing 5% and have to do 25 missions, didn't take any mathematical genius to know what their chances were of getting through.
Yeah.
So an awful lot of them were killed, and it was a...
You witnessed an unbelievable event that you were incapable of writing about, a ball turret gunner.
Yeah. I was on the B-17, and we were hit by German fighter pilots. And the ball turret, you're familiar with what it looks like under a bomber, presumably, and it was a very delicately geared thing. This guy sat in there was just room enough for him, and he had a gun. And he had buttons, and he could go in any direction. And then at one point, he got the ball in just the right position so that he could open a door and climb out into the airplane. Well, this guy, his thing was hit, and he was not killed. But all the gears on the ball turret were gone. And the ship was in tough shape, and they had to land. They had to land that, and the pilot knew what was happening. There was no choice he had. Here was this guy alive in the ball turret. The wheels on the plane were gone, had been shot out, and they just pancaked down on the ball turret. It was a bad day.
And you went back in London and could have written that story, but...
I suppose yeah, that was a tough story. I didn't try to write it. I had been too close to it.
You once said to me that you wrote so many stories early in the war about the sacrificial courage of these bomber boys that people would suspect your paper was a trade organ of the 8th Air Force. And yet, you wrote a story that was laced with humor, too, about a guy named Snuffy Smith.
Snuffy Smith. I can't use the word what Snuffy was, but it ends with up. And Snuffy Smith was a mid-turret gunner, and he had done everything wrong in camp. He was always on KP for one reason or another. And his plane was shot up, badly shot up. And one of the gunners on the ship had been hit and was bleeding to death. And the Germans were pretty good about if they got somebody in one of our planes that was wounded, they took him to a hospital. I don't know why they did that. And Snuffy Smith tried to do what he could for this friend of his, gunner, and he was bleeding to death, and Snuffy wound him up as tight as he could, took his parachute, took the cord of the parachute, shoved him out the door and opened the parachute. And he dropped to the ground with the parachute going. Snuffy never knew, and no one else ever knew whether the man ever lived or what happened to him. But then Snuffy did some other things, and he was given, awarded the Medal of Honor.
Medal of Honor.
And so I forget they changed the name from Secretary of War, public relations gesture. Now he's the Secretary of Defense. I mean, was that a public relations move? And the Secretary of Defense came over. Stimson, thank you, Don. And so they were looking for a hero to line up and that Stimson could give the medal to. And they picked Snuffy Smith because he had just gotten the Medal of Honor. So they line up, and Stimson comes, and they got the brass bands out there, and everybody's there. They can't find Snuffy Smith. He's on KP. It was one of the great embarrassments of the war.
Before you just didn't jump in a plane. I mean, the Air Force, before you allowed you and Walter Cronkite and others to fly. Cronkite was a UP reporter at the time. There were 5 of them who went up on the third American mission into Nazi Germany, a very dangerous mission to a submarine assembly plant, Wilhelmshaven. But before they could they had to be certified as gunners. So you went to gunnery school.
Yeah. And it's terrible. That was a good time. There were about 8 correspondents. Correspondents hung together, as they still do. One of the pleasures of my life is how close. I got a note from Brian Williams yesterday, and I wrote him back this morning before I came. It was the nicest note. And I said to him that how pleased I was over the years, considering how viciously competitive news people are on the job, how much we like and respect each other out of work. And it was a warming experience for me. But
so you went through that gunnery school.
I went through the gunnery school, and that's how I was able to fly on. I went on 3.
You had a wife back in the States. You did not have to fly.
Yeah.
How'd you feel on that plane on the tarmac when the propeller started to spin?
No, I thought, why the hell did I do this? I mean, I really did. I said, what am I doing here? Because and even if you weren't shot down, the chances of getting hit were big. I flew on 3 missions with the medium bombers, and they weren't all, just 2 missions with the B-17s, and the other ones were not nearly so dangerous. We went after submarine pens, and the submarine pens had some anti-aircraft guns, but they didn't have the fighter protection that the others went if you were going into Germany, so that was not as dangerous.
And Cronkite wrote a story about that, and there was a story about his story with Homer Biggert.
Yeah, Homer Biggert worked for the Herald Tribune, which was the chief competitor for the New York Times, and Homer was the best reporter. We all knew he was better than any of the rest of us. And Homer stammered badly. And so after this raid we were on, we all met and had something to eat and exchanged stories. There were 8 or 10 of us who had been on this raid. And so Cronkite, Cronkite is one of my best friends, but he's not the greatest writer in the world. And Homer Biggert wrote very well. So we started comparing what we had written. So Walter says, he reads his, he says, "I have just returned from a mission to hell at 5,000 feet. And Homer said, you wouldn't.
You were in a unique position once the war was over to compare ground and air combat. How would you compare the two?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
The bomber boys fought an intermittent war.
They did, and it was both good and bad because they lived a normal life much of the time. They went into London, had a good time, met girls, but then every 3 or 4 days when they had to go on the mission, the chance of getting killed was great, 5%. And that's when death is at stake, it's 5% is not a good number. And the infantry was in the mud and slop all the time. They never got clean clothes up. Never saw a girl. And I think to that extent, they got used to their life that way. It was in some ways easier than going in and out of it the way the Air Force people did, because it was so tough on the days they had to go on a raid. But then it was easy when they weren't. But the psychologically, I think emotionally, it was very difficult for the Air Force.
And then in the spring of '44, you were reassigned. You were going to take part in the great epic of the war, the D-Day invasion. And you went across.
Yeah, they shipped us all up to Bristol, a lot of people, because they needed a lot of boats, and they couldn't all leave from on the the Channel side of England. So I was up Bristol, and I got on a freighter, and we started out on D-Day, or D1, and took us around, and I went in on D4, and I was on the curve. Thank you. That's a comment. When they hand you a glass of water, it's
What about me, brother?
You don't sound as though you need it.
Oh.
So I got in there D4, and I'll tell you, it was still not very safe. D4 doesn't sound like much, but the Germans were still shelling the beaches, and they say they couldn't see the beaches because there were hills behind the beaches, so they were shelling willy-nilly, but the chance of getting hit were still pretty good. And then I went in, and I went in away from Normandy. I went in on Utah Beach, which is the elbow that goes out the Cotentin Peninsula towards Cherbourg. And I hooked up with the 4th Infantry Division and went away from the main war where they were fighting the Germans and went out towards Cherbourg. The Army desperately wanted to capture Cherbourg from the Germans because they needed, they were bringing everything into the beaches, and it was a very difficult thing to bring a big freighter out, and then you had to bring everything in small boats. So they wanted to get a major port, which Cherbourg was. So they sent the 4th Division out there, and I went along with them. And that was a great experience, altered by, I was with, I was so young, can you believe it? I didn't drink yet. And I was with Homer Biggert. And so we came on this cave, and it was the place where the German officers had stored all their liquor, and they were living high off the hog in Cherbourg. They had taken all the French liquor and wine they wanted, and we ran across that thing, and we loaded up the back of our Jeep, and I was ready to learn to drink at that point.
It's you've returned to the beaches on many occasions.
I do. It's interesting. I said it. I only like to go to places I've already been to at my age. I don't know why that is. I love to go back to Paris. I go to Paris once every 1 or 2 years, and I love to go to London. I lived in London for more than a year when I was writing for the Stars and Stripes, and I have been there many, many times since. I love both Paris and London, so I go back to Paris whenever I get the opportunity.
London was really the wartime capital of the world for the Allies. What was it like?
Oh, it was, and it was so exciting. And every couple of days there would be these sirens, and then the German bombers would come over, and it was dangerous. I mean, London was seriously damaged by German bombers, and we published the Army newspaper, the Stars and Stripes, in the London Times building, and it's the best printing plant in the world, or was then. And the people from the Times, they were hitting all around us, got so worried that they moved out of town to a smaller plant, and we took over their whole printing plant. And so we were able to turn out, I don't know, at the maximum, I think we were printing something like 800,000 Stars and Stripes. That's a lot of newspapers. Any newspaper in the Times-Picayune would love to have that.
On these return voyages, I mean, you've stood on the hill overlooking the cemetery on Omaha Beach.
Yes, I'm not emotional normally, but I'm telling you that if any of you go to France and get a chance to go to the cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach, it is one of the most dramatic things. I could cry right here now. Here are all these, well, they were crosses when I was there, and I objected because I'm not much of a Christian. And but here are thousands, 10,000 young American boys in the ground there, my age. They were my age. And I just kept thinking, my God, look at the life I've had that they never got to have. It was so sad. I mean, the Germans were up on those bluffs overlooking the hills, and you go there and look, and you can see what it was. I mean, they were just, it was a fish in a barrel shooting from those hills down into our guys wading in sometimes. They couldn't get the boats all the way in. They'd have to jump out up to their waist, and they got killed, a lot of them.
Yeah. At that point in your book on the war, you said that sometimes...
By the way, I have a new book out.
That's an old one, Andy.
That's an old one, but I have a new one on the market, which is called Out of My Mind. I came up with it sort of casually, but it's a pretty good title.
Well, anyway, in the old one, you talked about oftentimes feeling, I mean, you work really close to the front lines. I mean, in the bombers, on the front lines, and you got hell for it a lot, too, you know, from the Army, and got chased back and things like that. But at one point, you said something interesting, that you felt like you were almost copping out because you didn't have a gun and you weren't fighting and you could move wherever you wanted to.
Well, here I was the same age as these poor bastards who were in the infantry. And who was I? I'd been to college, but I had it better than they did. And I did feel guilty sometimes about not being in the fighting part of the war.
Yeah. What was the battle like in the Bocage, in Normandy, when we were bottled up like that?
Well, there were various parts of it. I know so much about, I can't get over it. It's nothing I can do anything with. And I know so much about a war. A war in a town or a city is interesting, and so much different than the war in the countryside. And one of the things that was interesting for everybody in the American Army, when they drove the Germans out of an area, a town for instance, I was very often alone in my Jeep, and our soldiers would go through in tanks or armored vehicles or something, and I trailing along in my Jeep alone. I mean, I was a great target for anybody. There was very little German sniping. In other words, when we went through a town, 10 German soldiers didn't sneak into the buildings and start shooting at us from the roof or anything. I was surprised. When they surrendered, that was the end of it for the Germans. It was very decent of them, really.
You witnessed one of the great breakouts of the war at St. Lo and got real close to the action there.
Yeah. It was interesting that St. Lo was so important a point as it was, but this happens everywhere. But although wars are not fought with lines much anymore, but if an army, we were bottled up on the beaches for a long while, from June 6th to July 27th, I think it was. And that's a long time to be bottled up with them shelling you. And when we got to St. Lo, there were heavy German forces there. And one of our commanders recognized that if we could break through at St. Lo and get a tank division or 10,000 men through that one small hole and then spread out, the Germans were all along the line, and we would then be behind the German lines. And that's what happened at St. Lo. We did take St. Lo, and were from that point on able to spread out. And the Germans panicked, and at that point they just picked up and ran from all the way along the Normandy coast. That was really the end of the invasion, of the terrible part of the war for us.
One of the things we're throwing around here at the conference is this idea of the Wehrmacht being a superior fighting force, a hypothesis, a superior fighting force to the American army, the big red one or whatever.
Oh, it wasn't true. I mean, it was, the Americans were so American. You know, they were not well disciplined, but Jesus, they would do anything. You know, they didn't stand in line and get counted every day. They just fought the war as individuals, and the Germans were still, there was a lot of lining up in the German army, even after we landed there. There was just no question that the American soldier made a better fighter than the German soldier. It's why the Germans lost the war right there. They could have repelled us. If they had fought the war sensibly when we came in Normandy, they could have driven us back into the Channel. So no, I don't. I have low regard for German fighters. They're great as scientists, but they did not make good soldiers.
Since we're dealing with the lower grade, you don't have a high opinion of General Patton.
That certainly will be the understatement of this meeting.
Why don't you explain?
Oh, well, first, he was a bad general. He got too many guys killed. He didn't take into consideration what was going to happen to the people he was sending forward. He was a loudmouth jerk. You know, he walked around in jodhpurs and a pearl-handled pistol on each hip. I mean, for what? He was going to shoot somebody with it? I mean, he was a bad general. And we had some great generals. Eisenhower, I always had great respect for Dwight Eisenhower. He was a great general, and he cared about his troops. He didn't want any more than necessary to get killed, and he did everything possible to protect them. And that was not true with Patton. I can't say enough bad about Patton as a general.
You once got a letter from Patton's daughter.
Yes. I had said something. You can tell it wouldn't have been friendly. I was talking about Patton, and I said something about him on the air, I guess. And I got a letter from Patton's daughter. And it was just one sentence. Dear Mr. Rooney, my father wouldn't have liked you either. I still have that letter. It's one of the great letters I ever got.
One of the great moments of the war for you and for so many people who were lucky to be there was the liberation of Paris.
Yes, we went into a little town called Rambouillet. It's about 25 kilometers outside of Paris. And there were maybe 20, 25 correspondents. The correspondents divided themselves up in press camps for the First Army, Second Army, and the Third Army, Patton's Third Army. And First Army had the most troops. And I had traveled with them mostly. And all the correspondents convened in this little town of Rambouillet, and there was this lovely little hotel there with maybe 30 or 40 rooms and a nice dining room. And the tank corps going forward into Paris was slow because as soon as you knock out the lead tank in a column, it delays the whole thing. I mean, if it's a narrow road, you can't get the rest of the vehicles past it. And the Germans had enough guns in place so that they often picked off one of our tanks and slowed the whole process. But it was determined, I guess it was August 24th, that the 4th Infantry Division with armored troops was going into Paris. And the French 2nd Division Blindée was also going in. So we had to choose which group to go in. Well, I was with an armored train in my Jeep, and it was a frightening experience because I was there out in the open with all these tanks going on. And at one point, the lead tank was hit, and they all closed their tank and huddled in their tanks. And I got out and ran because I didn't know what was going to happen. And I pulled my Jeep over so I wouldn't get run over by a tank and went over into the field, and I was down behind a stone wall looking to see where the fire was coming from. And I see this man over to my right, and I realized he was one of us. And it was Ernest Hemingway. How about meeting Ernest Hemingway behind a wall? And I had never cared much for Ernest Hemingway's work. I thought it was sort of bombastic. And I didn't tell him that, though. But then, the next day, we did go into Paris. And it was such a triumphant scene. I mean, there was never a better American military victory than the taking of Paris. Most of the Germans had fled by then. And we went in, and they staged a parade. Well, I suppose a lot of you have been to Paris. There is no place in the world that makes a better parade scene than that 1 mile slightly downhill from the Arc de Triomphe to the Place de la Concorde. It is just perfect. 1 mile, it's wide, so people can stand on either side and watch. So I'm down in the Place de la Concorde and viewing the whole thing, and Charles de Gaulle, he and Patton were cut from the same military uniform. And Charles de Gaulle stages this march, and he's got his hat on, you know, and he walks the mile on cobblestone street down from the from the Arc de Triomphe. And as he enters the Place de la Concorde, at this point, the place was ringed with tanks, mostly Sherman tanks. They were small tanks. We found they weren't very good and weren't very safe, so we gave them all to the French. And so they were mostly French in these tanks. And suddenly, the shot rang out from over the American embassy, which is at one side of the circle. And of course, everybody panics. They're shooting at de Gaulle. De Gaulle didn't flinch. And so all the tanks, it must have been 100 tanks that turned their guns where they could see a couple of men running across the top of the American embassy, and they just started shooting. And when I go there, there are columns in front of what is the building? It's some official French building next to the American embassy. And I go there and I see those columns with the pockmarks in them. You know, all that. This was in 1942, 3. And
44, yeah.
I look at those and then I drive my car in Paris. I always get a car, and I can drive with the French. I'm not any better driver than they are. I tour around. And I tour that Place de la Concorde. I go around that circle, and somebody cuts me off, and I think to myself, you son of a bitch, I know something about this place you'll never know.
And you witnessed the first the entrance of the Americans into the city with Ernie Pyle, on Ernie Pyle's balcony.
Yeah. Oh, can I tell that?
Tell it. I was gonna, but tell it.
Yes, Ernie Pyle was one of the correspondents that I hung out with. He was really a delightful guy and just a superb. He just knew what a story was, and he knew how to write it. He was better than any of us. And there was the hotel, there's a Scribe hotel that a lot of writers use. And then right across from that, forget the name of it, Grand. And it's a big hotel, a big fancy hotel. And Ernie Pyle and several other correspondents had rooms up on the top. We went up on the roof, and I went up there with them. And here we are looking at this wild scene of American soldiers, and they are being besieged by French girls. You know, they're running up to them, hugging them. And Ernie Pyle, who didn't use any rough language ever, he says, any GI who doesn't get laid tonight is a sissy.
You got mail on that.
Probably. Probably get mail again.
Well,
I see a couple of letter writers here.
Yeah. You would know them. Then there was, of course, the drive to the Siegfried Line, the drive to the German border, and eventually the drive to the Rhine. And you saw obliterated city after obliterated city, Aachen, all the way in Dortmund. Any feelings about remorse about the civilians who were killed in the bombing and the artillery raids?
I didn't at the time. Aachen was a particularly dramatic place. It was a big city, and it was towards the end of the war. And I went in with the tanks, and I saw them. That's where I was so impressed. Did I say this earlier? Here we had just taken this huge city. Aachen was a big city, million, I suppose. And here were these American tanks in the middle of their streets, stalled because there was really no place for them to go anyway. And it was just very difficult for them to move. And we had moved all these tanks in the city. It was probably a dumb move. And no one, there was not a sniper. There were no German people. They all had guns. There was nobody up on those roofs shooting at us. And I never understood that. You wouldn't have found that in an American city. I mean, if the Germans had moved into an American city as we moved into Aachen, there would have been snipers everywhere, and it would not have been safe for any Germans in the tanks in our streets. It was very interesting phenomenon. I found it.
You talked to the guys, and you experienced what they were experiencing. Did they have any feelings about the German people, the civilians, that they, as they
The GIs?
Yeah.
No, I don't think they did.
Yeah.
I don't think there was any great hatred involved. In Normandy, there were a lot of Germans. They were mostly French, of course, but there were a lot of Germans in Normandy who had been stationed there, and the GIs got to know some of them, and there was always there was always somebody who spoke some German. I didn't realize that the Jewish language is so close to the German language, and quite often American Jewish soldiers could communicate with the Germans.
Yeah. You know, Eddie,
In Yiddish, yeah.
it seemed that you were either the right or the wrong place every time. I mean, you were there at the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen when the famous breakthrough took place.
Oh, that was a lucky break. I was at that point traveling with the 9th Armored Division, and I knew we were getting close to the Rhine. And the Rhine was another place like the beaches in Normandy. It was this, I mean, the Rhine is a big river, and it's a great, to get an army across a river that wide is some event. I mean, you can't, boats, and how do you do it? So the Germans had destroyed bridges all up and down the Rhine. And we got to Ludendorff, and the Ludendorff Bridge, one of the big railroad bridge in Germany, was intact. We could not believe it. Our generals were just stunned. And we poured division over that night. We got 10,000 people across that bridge, and it was substantially the end of the war. And then the next day, the Germans couldn't see it anymore because there were hills behind the bridge, but they still had their artillery. They were shooting 8 or 10 miles, and they were dropping shells, and they finally hit the Ludendorff Bridge and brought it down. But by that time, we had a lot of guys across the river.
And yet you got a story back home on that bridge with photographs, and you didn't have a camera.
Oh, God, thanks for leading me to that. There was this lieutenant,
Marcus Hoffman, and he lived in San Francisco. And I talked to him, and he liked the idea that I was a Stars and Stripes reporter. And he was attached to a group that was going across the bridge. But he had a camera. And he was really more interested in the pictures he was taking than in the war at that point. And I said, you know, it's just too bad these pictures you're taking are not going to be seen by anybody except when you get home in San Francisco. And I said, would you give me your negatives, and I will get them to Paris tonight and get them in the Stars and Stripes tomorrow. I knew I could do it. Yeah. And so he gave me his film, swearing, and I swore on my death that I would get them back to him the next day. Well, I went back the next day, and of course he had crossed the bridge and gone on with his group. I never got his pictures back to him. Felt bad about that for 50 years. I wrote about it in a book I did 2 or 3 years ago. And I went out to San Francisco on some other event, and he called me. A friend of his called me, had seen it. And I had his name, and he still lived in San Francisco. He called me, and I gave him back his pictures. It was just one of the damnedest events in my life. Buchenwald, you were one of the first reporters to witness the camps, and you had said that in France you didn't quite know whether or not to believe the stories that were coming out of Germany about the camps.
It was hard to believe that they were as advertised. I mean, I had never seen one. I hadn't seen pictures of them. I don't know why, because there were none. But I didn't go into Buchenwald. I went into several of the smaller camps, not that it mattered. And
tell them about Thekla.
Thekla was the small camp I went into. And I suppose it had 5,000 prisoners. I suppose they were mostly French. But they were living in these barracks. And when we got close, some of them ran for the barbed wire that surrounded the camp that they were in. And I got there the next day, and God, it was a terrible scene. There must have been 50 men impaled on the barbed wire. They had run to the barbed wire and tried to fight their way through it and been shot right there, and they hung there.
After the Germans had poured gasoline on them.
Yeah, the Germans had poured gasoline on the buildings and lit them. That's why they had to get out. Yeah, thank you.
But you wrote an incredible line then, that thinking back to your time when you were considering...
You really read my book, didn't you?
I read your books. I even read Air Gunner. Andy wrote 2 wonderful books during the war. One, Air Gunner, about 8th Air Force air gunners, co-authored it, and a wonderfully colorful, exciting history of Stars and Stripes.
It's called The Story of the Stars and Stripes. Yeah. And I wrote it with a friend, Bud Hutton, and we came home from Europe, and the book was published. And we'd been home in New York, back in New York, for 4 or 5 weeks. And MGM called us, and they bought our book. We were out of the Army a couple of weeks at $160 a month. They bought our book for $55,000. I thought making money was easy.
And you went to Hollywood.
Went to Hollywood and worked out there for a year, and then went back to Germany, Cosmopolitan magazine, which was a different magazine then than it is now. The girls were better looking in it then. And we went back and wrote another book, and it was 10 pieces for Cosmopolitan magazine about what America had bought for their investment in blood and money when they invaded Europe to drive out the Germans.
The line I was going to quote, Andy, is this. After seeing Thekla, he writes that, "I never knew that any peace is not better than any war."
Oh, yeah, I had been so close to being a pacifist. And that was my thought, that I could not believe that there would ever be a peace that was a war that was better than any peace. And certainly that war was one that had to be fought. I don't think this one we're fighting is one we have to fight, but still I'm that memory of how I felt then keeps me from being too adamant about the suggestion that we have to pull out of Iraq.
Mm-hmm. Your final service was in the China, Burma, India theater.
Yes, after the war, I was going to cover the signing,
European War, yeah.
signing of the surrender by the Germans. And I got an opportunity to go to the CBI, China, Burma, India. And I had to go. A deposed general had just flown into Paris, and his plane was leaving the next day. And I had to decide right then whether to give up the job of covering the surrender or whether to go. And I chose to go. And it was great because I got to see parts of the world I never would have seen otherwise. We flew to Nice from Paris, and then from Nice we went to Cairo. And one of the luckiest things happened to me in Cairo. I had always wanted to see Cairo. And this pilot, bringing the plane in, clipped a telephone pole with the edge of the wing, and we had to stay in Cairo for 6 days while the plane was fixed, so I was delighted by the accident. And then we took off, and I went to India, and I don't know how people live there. I mean, we have a lot of heat here in this country, but I have never known heat like they have in Bombay, for instance. It's just intolerable. I don't see how people operate. And maybe if you live there for all your life, you can stand it, but I couldn't take it. And then I went up and flew into China, and I I decided there was a good story. They had a bunch of American mules, and they were dragging helicopters up into the Himalaya mountains on the China side, because so many of our helicopters were crashing up in the mountains, and they wanted to rescue a lot of these people, so they were going to bring these helicopters up. So I joined the group and went up into the mountains with the helicopter people, and they got up to where they were at the base of the mountain, and they started screwing these helicopters together. In a couple of days, they had them together, and they realized where we were in the mountain was above the altitude the helicopter could lift off the ground.
And then, of course, you're back in the States, you're in New York with your wife for VJ Day, and your war's over. But William Wyler, Hollywood director, once made, he made Memphis Belle, and he had,
Sure.
like you, he went up to the air bases, and he described his experiences on those bases as an escape to reality. He said, nothing mattered, money didn't matter, status didn't matter, fellowship mattered. Mm-hmm. And he said, what an awful thing that it takes a war to create that sort of thing.
Yeah, good statement. It is.
Did you find that?
Well, there's no doubt that the standards were different in war. Things that matter most to us in this life didn't matter at all during the war.
And finally, Andy, Tom Brokaw helped to revitalize interest in the war and created a label for you guys, the greatest generation, but you've never taken to that term.
I told Tom's a good friend of mine, and I said, Tom, that's not true. I mean, we were not the greatest generation. My generation had a war to fight, and I believe that the current generation, given that war that had to be fought, would fight it just as we did. I think our great generation got the reputation for being great for what we did, but I think any generation would have done the same thing.
Well, thank you for your service, and thank you for being here, Andy.
You were so good, Don.
That was fantastic.